Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me. My name is Amanda Halley. I'm a college professor, and I'm also a costume and cultural consultant for the movie, TV, and gaming industries. And right now, I'm going to make like Marilyn Monroe in How to Marry a Millionaire, put my glasses on, and let's start scratching that 60-year itch. So why am I talking to you today about Marilyn Monroe? Well, every decade and every socio-political and cultural movement since made Marilyn Monroe its own, which is why I'm calling this the 60-year itch, because we keep scratching it. And it seems that Marilyn is everywhere, resonating to generations who have never shared a planet with her, some of whom have never seen a Marilyn Monroe movie, and yet Marilyn is as omnipresent as she ever was. The internet went wild. I'm sure you all remember this. It went wild with possibly feigned outrage over Kim Kardashian wearing Marilyn's Happy Birthday Mr. President dress to the Met Gala. On loan from Ripley's Believe It or Not, as a costume historian, I was actually outraged. There was nothing feigned about my outrage. But I couldn't help but wonder how many in the Twitter sphere truly care about the preservation of historic textiles. And I wondered what the object of their outrage was. Was it because somebody other than Marilyn Monroe had worn one of Marilyn's dresses? Was it because Kim Kardashian was wearing the dress and perhaps deemed unworthy of it? For at the end of the day, this is a dress owned by Ripley's, who, in fairness, and as outrageous as it was, can loan it to whoever they like. And let's face it, it was not worn at perhaps the classiest moment in Marilyn's life. Chinese fashion label CR Fashion caused an internet uproar with their digital recreations of Marilyn wearing their collections. This controversy went viral, inviting the question as to whether or not the dead should be employed to shill for the living. We have studied every single moment of Marilyn's life. Here are some books about Marilyn Monroe. And here are some more books about Marilyn Monroe. And here are some more books on Marilyn Monroe. And look, here are some more. Every single moment of Marilyn's life has been dissected and studied and written about. And Marilyn was a movie star whose career was rather fleeting compared to the Katharine Hepburns or Henry Fondas of the Hollywood scene. And yet she has had more books written about her than anybody else. This appetite for devouring every crumb of Norma Jean's existence seems necessitating millions of words, decade after decade after decade, each author claiming a new angle, a new approach, a new way of looking at a woman we have all looked at an awful lot. And this fascination with Marilyn Monroe isn't just confined to the written word. Fine artists have sourced the sex symbol as inspiration. Forever, almost 70 years ago, Willem de Kooning created his abstracted Marilyn canvas of 1954. Of course, Warhol's duplicated Marilyn's. These explosions of silk-screened neons did much to secure her status as a visual icon, a representation of America, of the 20th century, of the question of authenticity. British pop artist Peter Blake has returned to Marilyn multiple times throughout his career, from the 60s to the 2010s, and Italian pop artist Mimo Rotella applied his iconic ripped poster art to Marilyn many times as well, making his overarching intent of discussing the fragmented and ephemeral nature of 20th century culture specific to Marilyn Monroe and her life. In the shadow of her death in 1962, James Rosenquist also fragmented Marilyn's image, using the typography from Coca-Cola cans to speak to Marilyn as a consumer product who was then consumed by fame. In 1967, Robert Rauschenberg took the absence of presence and the presence of absence, one of his perennial fascinations, and applied it to Marilyn the woman, this candle in the wind trope, just one of the many that would follow the dead star down the decades. To artists, Marilyn Monroe has become something of almost an allegorical figure, used in much the same way as Venus or Eve or Cleopatra, everybody seizing upon her across the decades to represent everything from eternal beauty to forbidden sex to the melancholy of vacuous commercialism to the sacrificial lamb. Whatever you want to talk about in a painting, Marilyn can be your model. It's not surprising that Netflix have cornered the Marilyn market somewhat with a documentary, The Mystery of Marilyn Monroe. It was compelling stuff, but at the end of the day, the mystery of Marilyn Monroe is why anyone still thinks that there is a mystery. As we've gone back to that particular well so often that there's not a drop of fresh water to be had there, really. And Blonde, a dramatization of Marilyn's life, is airing on Netflix, starring the lovely Ana Diarmas as the ill-fated star. But here's the question. Why Marilyn? Why Marilyn? Why Marilyn? Why, out of all the stars who twinkled bright and faded fast, have we fixated on this star, decade after decade? Is it because she was just so beautiful? Well, there were plenty of other movie stars of Marilyn's era whose beauty compared to hers. Elizabeth Taylor was beautiful. Grace Kelly was beautiful. Sophia Loren was beautiful. Brigitte Bardot was beautiful. So I'd say no, the fact that Marilyn was beautiful probably helped her legend, but I don't think it accounts for her legend. Was it because she died young? Well, dying young certainly helps when it comes to everlasting popularity, doesn't it? From Buddy Holly to John Lennon to Kurt Cobain, Janis Joplin, Elvis Presley, Amy Winehouse, Sid Vicious. They all died too young and are all possibly more famous because of it. But untimely deaths are not unique to Marilyn, and she wasn't the only beautiful movie star who died young. Jean Harlow died young, 10 years younger than Marilyn was, in fact, and arguably just as famous in the 1930s as Marilyn was in the 50s and early 60s. Carole Lombard died young while doing something very patriotic and heroic. Jane Mansfield died young. And yet, where are the endless art pieces, the books, the documentaries, the docudramas about Harlow and Lombard and Mansfield? They don't exist. It's only Marilyn. Oh, could it have been because Marilyn may have been murdered? Well, I don't think so either, because you know what? Thelma Todd was possibly murdered. And sadly, Sharon Tate truly was murdered. So I don't think that the conspiracy theories that surround the death of Marilyn also explain why we are so obsessed with this dead star. Well, was it because she was the greatest actress of her generation? Well, Marilyn's acting abilities improved tremendously during her lifetime as she took acting very seriously. She was interested in the craft. She studied with the Strasberg, studied the method at the actor studio. We know all of this. But I think, in fairness to Marilyn, we can probably agree that there were other actresses of her generation who had perhaps harnessed their talents a little more convincingly than Marilyn Monroe. So, why is it Marilyn, always Marilyn, and sometimes only Marilyn, who has captured our collective imagination so much, who has enshrined herself into our cultural landscape to such an obsessive degree? Well, here's an idea. Marilyn existed at a cultural nexus when pop culture was considered a topic of high culture. and she died at a very specific moment of cultural revolution. That is possibly the beginning of understanding why Marilyn remains so popular. And also, Marilyn can be whatever we want her to be. She is arguably the canvas onto which we have perpetually painted any and all of our cultural concerns or artistic intents. Silver screen siren, tragic victim, personification of modern America, you name it, and Marilyn can wear it, even if we have to stitch her into it, like the famous dress she wore while singing Happy Birthday to the President, which, by the way, is another erroneous fact about Marilyn Monroe. She did not actually have to be stitched into that very tight dress. Evidently, there was a little pucker, a little bit of puckering at the fastening, and a stitch was put in so that the dress would lie smooth. She wasn't stitched into it. But hey, why let the truth get in the way of a good story? An adage that can be applied to almost every aspect of Marilyn's life. Marilyn's face can fit any discussion we have, any issue we want it to. Marilyn Monroe is the mirror we use to reflect ourselves. And when Marilyn looks into the mirror, she sees us looking back at her, 60 years of us looking back at her. And Marilyn makes for the perfect avatar to apply to ourselves, as even in her tragically short lifetime, there were so many Marilyns, so many different and often contradicting aspects to the actress that we're sure to find one that fits what we need her to be. We created Marilyn in our own image, which is ironic because Marilyn was a woman she created herself. This is Marilyn Monroe without makeup. Well, of course it is. It's Marilyn the woman, and a very pretty woman she is too. But does she really look like Marilyn Monroe? Marilyn Monroe, the movie star? No, we need her eyebrows. We need her eyeshadow, her signature cat eyes, and her false eyelashes, and of course those glossy lips. And then she starts to resemble Marilyn, the avatar, the goddess of magazine covers and posters and screensavers, a pretty woman in her natural state, of course, but I would argue that it is Marilyn made up that we imagine when we hear the movie star's name. Do we ever really picture Marilyn in black and white? I would wager that it's Technicolor Marilyn we see in our mind's eye, this luminescent creature composed of dazzling colors with this neon yellow hair and red lips, a woman who in reality looked little like the woman we imagine in our minds, this siren of the silver screen. Marilyn Monroe was essentially a role that she played, and she would step in and out of it. And our ever-changing view of Marilyn Monroe says more about us than it does about her, perhaps. But the fact that it was a role to begin with makes it all the easier for us to apply our own intent upon her. And just as Marilyn herself is said to have ultimately found herself emotionally and psychologically lost between Marilyn the movie star and Marilyn the woman, it was certainly this dichotomy that Warhol explored in his Marilyn diptych, created shortly after her death. So let's go through just some, of Marilyn's many personas and how we have appropriated them over the decades. And let's start with Marilyn, the sex symbol. And not just a sex symbol of the silver screen, a sex kitten, the girl with the skirt blowing up as she stands over a subway vent in The 7 Year Itch, but Marilyn, a symbol of sex. Marilyn the woman, who presented herself or was at least interpreted as a woman who was perpetually available for sex, who wanted sex, who loved sex. And this was really quite shocking and almost lascivious thinking in her day. And this was an idea that Marilyn herself cultivated from her first appearance on the cover of Playboy in 1953, that cover and the now famous and perhaps infamous photograph of a naked Marilyn against the red background. Marilyn was both sexually exploited and she exploited her own sexuality. From the start of her career to the very end of her life, today we can view Marilyn's liberated attitude to her own body and her enjoyment of sex as refreshingly honest. But at the time, it was often seen as rather louche, lascivious, something respectable women didn't want to do and certainly didn't talk about. On film, Marilyn could be both sexual predator and sexual prey. In The 7-Year Itch, she was prey. In Niagara, she was predator. We can argue that in Some Like It Hot, she was actually both. But whether an innocent creation to satisfy the male gaze or a sexually liberated creature of her own creation, sex was certainly at the center of Marilyn's public persona during her lifetime and beyond. I mean, take a look at these front pages from pulp magazines of her era. Look at this. This ordinary Joe sure made time on that couch with Marilyn Monroe. What about this one? Does MMM stand for men, men, men? And this one, I confess, Marilyn's evil affair. And Marilyn certainly fanned the flames of this image of herself as a perpetually willing sexual partner. Look at this famous quote. Sex is part of nature. I go along with nature. Not very shocking today, of course, but outrageous in the uptight mid-century where discussion of sex was confined to the psychiatrist's couch or read about very furtively in the Kinsey Report. And it's Marilyn as an allegory for sexual availability that we see in de Kooning, with this depiction, this almost carnivorous creature in bright reds and yellows, sexually devouring, almost monstrous. And it's male gaze Marilyn that's certainly doing the rounds right now and with quite a bit of controversy in the form of this 26-foot statue by Seward Johnson. It's fans proclaiming it to be a joyful tribute to an iconic movie moment. Its detractors appalled by this opportunity to look up Marilyn's skirt and take a selfie. In 1972, Bert Stern's beautiful last-sitting photographs of Marilyn were packaged as a serious literary work by way of an accompanying text by Norman Mailer, who seemed unhealthily obsessed with Monroe's sexuality. Some of his prose bordering on erotic fiction as he waxed lyrical about her appetites. In 1972, Gloria Steinem's article on Marilyn for Ms. Magazine also focused on Marilyn's sexuality, but a sexuality that was horribly exploited by both the men in her life and a public who condemned her for it. So here we have a posthumous Marilyn discussed through the optic of the early 1970s, but with utterly opposing approaches to serve equally opposing agendas. So Marilyn, as both a sex symbol and a vessel for sex, feeds into many of her other personas that we'll also discuss. Marilyn the victim, Marilyn the train wreck, Marilyn the feminist, oh yes, Marilyn the fashion icon, Marilyn the personification, and murdered Marilyn. And on a far more superficial level, Marilyn created a visual template to immediately recognize a sexy young woman, a sexy young character, a tight black dress with tousled chin-length hair, and voila, we have the sexy girl straight from central casting. Debbie Harry did Marilyn Monroe in the 70s through the optic of punk rock. Madonna used no lens at all and just took Marilyn lock, stock, and barrel and applied it to herself, as have countless of others who seize upon this visual shorthand that Marilyn created 60 or 70 years ago. Yet the Marilyn persona that few wish to imitate is what I am calling Trainwreck Marilyn. This is the Marilyn who was always late to the set. This was the Marilyn who always forgot her lines, who was famously fired from George Cukor's Something's Got to Give. The Nembutol addicted mess who made life a misery for everybody around her because she was so strung out. This is the Marilyn of the incoherent late night phone calls, the reckless Marilyn, embroiling herself in situations she couldn't control due to lack of self-control. And although this Marilyn was discussed in quite a few tell-all books of the 70s and 80s by those who claimed to have had an acquaintanceship with her, Trainwreck Marilyn resurfaced in the 2010s with the internet's appetite for clickbait, rehashing old scandal for new generations and billing it as shocking new revelations. Marilyn was a total slob, a coroner's report, gossip from decades ago about her personal hygiene, really unpleasant stuff. Marilyn was actually cyber-bullied. At a moment of the internet, of our contemporary culture, that reveled in the misfortunes of anyone with internet or a Wi-Fi, believing that they had the power to destroy a reputation with a click of a mouse or a swipe of a phone. It was really quite horrible and terribly unfair. Yet this horribly unkind and probably exaggerated view of Marilyn as somehow unfit to function feeds into two of her other personas, Marilyn the victim and Marilyn the everywoman. And Marilyn the victim is a view of the woman that is not exaggerated, sadly, and it needs none of the hyperbole applied to her many other facades. Abandoned by her father and with a mother committed to mental institution, Marilyn was raised in orphanages and foster homes, sexually assaulted at 12 years old, sexually harassed by Hollywood high-ups, addicted to prescription drugs, and suffering from very real psychological illnesses. Experts today maintain that Marilyn presented all the classic signs of bipolarism. But in an era before this was probably recognized, yet alone diagnosed, yet our understanding of Marilyn's truly terrible childhood, for example, is not born of any new research. Marilyn told us all about it herself when she wrote her autobiography, My Story, way back in 1954, with Ben Hecht as co-author. Yet it wasn't published until 1974. One can guess that in her lifetime, the studio suppressed it, as such a sad, truly sad and harrowing tale was hardly analogous with the wide-eyed, breathy, wiggle-walking sex symbol they were selling. And at the point of her death, no one seemed interested in what may have brought Marilyn to her death, these terrible events and situations that led to such an emotional, fragile state. Nobody wanted a victim at the point of Marilyn's death. They wanted a scandal. Marilyn as victim was explored and sympathetically in Richard Hamilton's work of 1965, a collage of the mostly rejected contact sheet photographs from George Barris's final photo shoot with Marilyn, the last photo shoot of her life. These candid photos on a beach, Marilyn putting a cross through the photos she rejected. Yet a cross is also the symbol we use for a kiss, isn't it? So here we have a Marilyn reaching out for love and withdrawing from it, cancelling herself out with crosses that are also kisses. Elton John focused on Marilyn, the victim, with his hit song Candle in the Wind, as did Gloria Steinem with her article for Ms. Magazine. Yet, tributes from artists and songwriters and thinkers of this era, however sensitive, somehow fed into an idea that there was something intrinsically broken about Marilyn Monroe, and that what she suffered was strangely unique to her. Yet our current understanding of mental illness has utterly repositioned Marilyn Monroe. And it speaks to Marilyn as the every woman. Underneath it all, we like to think that Marilyn Monroe was just like us. And in the age of social media, when anyone can be a celebrity on Instagram or TikTok if they get enough likes or shares, it's no surprise to see that Marilyn's candid image of her doing regular things like riding the subway or eating a hot dog or cooking are beloved of Generation Snapchat. They can draw non-existent parallels between arguably the most famous woman who has ever walked the planet and themselves. Which might explain the infinitely tweeted and retweeted photographs of Marilyn without makeup, as some sort of proof that, while a very pretty woman, she was no goddess, and yet, at the same time, the internet goes crazy with YouTube videos and blogs telling everyone how to look like Marilyn Monroe. We can all look like Marilyn Monroe. Again, Marilyn fitting into whatever narrative we want to create. Yet, hard as one might try to massage her into the role of every woman, it never really works, because Marilyn Monroe was not the every woman. She was, and still is, Marilyn Monroe. We may now accept that she was a very real woman, but she has been an allegorical figure for so long that it's kind of hard to buy her as the girl next door, which brings me to her next persona. Americana Marilyn. Now, this started to emerge in the 1970s when movie star Marilyn became the poster girl for the 1970s 50s revival. Happy Days, American Graffiti, Grease, Laverne and Shirley. The 70s were obsessed with the 1950s, this rose-tinted nostalgia for an era before Vietnam, before that season of assassinations of the 1960s, before Watergate. Although short-lived, while it lasted, the 1950s revival informed everything. Fashion reviving bobby socks and poodle skirts, photo shoots in American diners, ubiquitous in every ad and fashion magazine. Americana, harnessed with either irony, affection, or in many cases, affectionate irony, was everywhere. And visually, Marilyn Monroe was the juiciest slice of that American pie. No 70s home was complete without a Marilyn bust, or a Marilyn lamp, or clock, or a mug, or this weird ceramic figure. This was about the 1950s, not really about Marilyn Monroe. The America of the 50s, Marilyn becoming the female face of the 1950s. This is 7-year itch Marilyn, her skirt blowing upwards. It is always, or very often always, Marilyn in the 7-year itch dress that you find in Americana Marilyn of the 1970s, and I have a theory as to why. Well, certainly the subway event scene is sexy and iconic, but I think it may have been the dress itself that resonated so strongly with the 70s, this white halter neck number in a slinky, silky textile. Because this dress was revived in the 70s. This was such a popular dress of the 1970s. Here's Halston's version. Here's McCall's version. Here's Farrah Fawcett in a version of this dress. I digress, I know, but I'm a fashion historian too, and I just can't help myself. But Americana Marilyn didn't have to carry the 50s and the 70s all by herself. She was joined by Elvis, by James Dean, and sometimes Humphrey Bogart would be jimmied in, even though he doesn't really belong with the other three. The four of them appearing together constantly in fantasy scenarios, like this reimagining of Hopper's Nighthawks, and sometimes Bogart is switched out for Marlon Brando. These iconic screen stars losing their own identity and sort of becoming this family of Americana, either ironically or affectionately. It's difficult to understand, but Marilyn, you'll notice, is the only gal in the grouping. And this imaginary alliance continues into the digital age. Marilyn, alongside Dean and Presley and Bogart and sometimes Brando, a symbol of some sort of America. And it can be argued that Warhol's many depictions of Marilyn have also become a symbol of Americana, with or without the irony intended. Featured on a billion t-shirts and totes, Warhol's Marilyn is akin to a pop-art version of Marcel Duchamp's à l'HEEQ. Only now, in the 21st century, we can apply even more questions. Are Warhol's Marilyn Monroe's Marilyn Monroe? Are they Andy Warhol's? Are they about Marilyn? Are they about consumerism? Or are they, as I suspect, about America itself? Just as Marilyn is held up as a symbol so often of some sort of America. Let's move on to another one of Marilyn's personas that has ebbed and flowed over the decades. Murdered Marilyn. There are countless books, articles, documentaries, blogs theorizing on Marilyn's supposed murder. Was she murdered by JFK? She was murdered by Bobby Kennedy. Was she murdered by the CIA, the FBI, LBJ? Murdered by the mafia? Murdered by Castro? Was she murdered because she knew too much about UFOs? For some, there isn't a movie star Marilyn, really. There is only murdered Marilyn. Her death, which did have some anomalies surrounding it, so chronologically close to the assassination of JFK that the two deaths have sort of become intertwined strangely. Now, although I should make this clear, I personally don't subscribe to the idea that Marilyn Monroe was murdered. I do understand why these theories started to circulate in the late 1960s. The Vietnam War, that terrible season of assassinations, JFK, Robert Kennedy, Dr. King, Malcolm X, so many. And then, of course, Watergate. All of this adding to this sense of disillusionment, of governmental distrust. Marilyn's death sort of pulled into all of this as another example of a cover-up or a whitewash. Murdered Marilyn is sort of a character in her own right, a vessel on which to put various conspiracy theories centered upon suspicions of governmental corruption or deception. And it feeds into a sense of disillusionment that many Americans felt and many Americans still do feel. There are still plenty of blogs about who killed Marilyn Monroe. But on a cheerier note, let's take a look at another Marilyn, one that started to emerge in the 1990s and whose reputation has certainly grown. Marilyn the Seeker. Ignored or laughed at in her own lifetime and generally unacknowledged in the first 3 decades after her death, Marilyn Monroe, as a curious, self-educated and proto-intellectual, started to emerge in the 1990s, replacing Americana Marilyn, Sex Kitten Marilyn, and even Murdered Marilyn. And this Marilyn, a voracious reader of books and asker of questions, seems very much rooted in truth. Take a look at this cheesecake photograph of Marilyn captured early in her career standing in her apartment. On first glance, of course, this is sex symbol Marilyn, but if we zoom in on the books on her bookcase, we see a surprising collection of highbrow literature, books on philosophy, on art, on history. Marilyn's reading lists were impressive throughout her life. Here we have Madame Bovary and Emily Dickinson, and when photographed reading Ulysses, evidently the photographer swears she was really reading Ulysses, although she did admit that she struggled with it. But then again, I think we have all struggled with James Joyce. The museum where I work as a consultant, the Museo de la Moda in Santiago, Chile, showcased the intellectual side of Marilyn Monroe in a recent exhibition. Look at that impressive array of books, all of that Proust. It's really impressive stuff. Marilyn wasn't only interested in poetry, she wrote poetry. She also drew and painted. Here are some of her original sketches, and they're really quite lovely, aren't they? She created art because she studied art. And we all know she studied acting and she took her craft very, very seriously. She was a student at the Strasbergs, studying the method at the Actors Studio, and this was common knowledge in her lifetime, but it was laughed off. Sort of, oh, a dumb blonde who wants to be taken seriously. But from the 90s onwards, we recognize that far from wanting to be taken seriously, Marilyn was serious. She was serious about her craft, and she was serious about herself. And it is this Marilyn that we find in 2012's Fragments, a book featuring her poetry, her intimate letters that speak to her interest in acting, in literature, in art. And this Marilyn feeds in very nicely to the next Marilyn persona we have seized upon. Marilyn the feminist, a far more recent incarnation that disinters her from all of the other roles and places her front and center as, yes, a proto-feminist. This is the Marilyn who formed her own production company so that she would have more control over her work and her income. This is the Marilyn whose sexual candor is now seen as female empowerment and bravely erasing double standards. And this is the Marilyn of The Girl by Michelle Morgan, published in 2018. Marilyn Monroe, The 7-Year Itch, and the Birth of an Unlikely Feminist. And the emergence of Marilyn the feminist has repositioned so many of the other Marilyns, because through the lens of feminism, Marilyn the victim becomes Marilyn the survivor. Marilyn the train wreck becomes Marilyn the liberated woman. Marilyn the seeker becomes Marilyn the smart, Marilyn the successful. And this brings us to one of her more recent incarnations, which I am dubbing #Marilyn. Social movements and social media appropriating Marilyn to represent a cause. And it's incredible and speaks so positively to the woman herself, just how many hashtags Marilyn fits. #LGBTQ+. This awareness and fight for equality has taken Marilyn to both its heart and to its hashtags. Marilyn is analogous with gay pride. Gay pride parades and marches featuring drag Marilyns that speak to the actress's non-discriminatory and utterly accepting nature. #Body Positive Marilyn. The internet has recently been overrun with memes discussing Marilyn's position as a fully figured woman. Marilyn Monroe, one of the most beautiful women in the world, was a size 14. And although the famous meme that talks about her dress size is a little historically inaccurate, a size 14 in Marilyn's day was more like a size 8 today. It doesn't matter. The message is strong. And Marilyn was the perfect poster girl for fully figured women and has been appropriated hugely by the body positive movement. And of course, hashtag Me Too. Hashtag Marilyn Me Too obviously appeared when we started using that hashtag, and she's the perfect fit. And we can see how social media took her as one of the original victims of Hollywood misogyny and sexual harassment. This is very recent, but she really is the ideal person to speak to the historic grounding of this movement. And take a look at this piece of art here. This is actually titled Marilyn Monroe, hashtag Me Too by Salome Delpour. Hashtag BLM Marilyn. The internet has absolutely fallen in love, quite rightly, with the lovely story of Marilyn Monroe's sweet friendship with Ella Fitzgerald and how the star championed Ella in an era of segregation. Lots of memes floating around the internet about this lovely story, so many that it spawned a children's book, Making Their Voices Heard, which tells the story of this friendship. 2020, Vivian Kirkfield with illustrations by Aliana Harris. What a lovely idea for a book. Marilyn the Goddess. Now, let's look at Marilyn the Goddess, and I don't mean sex goddess, I don't mean screen goddess, I mean a real goddess. A Greek deity, almost a medieval saint, a modern martyr to be revered with an almost religious fervor. This is certainly the Marilyn that artist Paolo Schmidlin depicted in his painted bronze sculpture, Marilyn at Rest. So realistic is this that the internet claimed erroneously that it was a photograph of the real Marilyn Monroe in her casket. Marilyn didn't have an open casket, but she was interred wearing her favorite green Pucci dress. Marilyn as saint, Marilyn as goddess, is also evident in the various auctions of her personal effects. From lipsticks to photographs to unsmoked cigarettes, anything that Marilyn has ever touched is now sought after and fought over by bidders at auctions. It's almost like they are fragments of the true cross or one of John the Baptist's fingernails. This is almost like medieval reliquary. When Christie's held the first auction of Marilyn Monroe's personal effects in 1999, pieces of what really were detritus from Marilyn's life that were estimated for $2,000-3,000 sold for tens of thousands of dollars, even hundreds of thousands of dollars. This market for Marilania, and I really hope I just invented that word, growing and growing. Even things she never owned or never touched, like this contact sheet from Bert Stearns' last sitting, selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. But why not? Because Marilyn really is American royalty. This is another persona. When you remember that in the 21st century, Marilyn is American royalty. The United States of America, by its very definition, doesn't have a royal family. But do you think that perhaps we've created a royal family made up of Elvis Presley and JFK and Jackie Kennedy and Grace Kelly and Audrey Hepburn, who wasn't actually American at all? And after all is said and done, after all the scandal, all the sensationalism, all the rumors, the half-truths, The hyperbole Marilyn Monroe has become part of this all American royal family. Yet perhaps Marilyn's ever changing status and our ever changing culture is far simpler than any of this. Marilyn is, perhaps, the perfect personification of the American dream come true and the American dream gone horribly and tragically wrong. The last time I gave a talk, it was on our 2,000-year obsession with Cleopatra. And as I was putting this talk together, I couldn't help but wonder if in 2,000 years we'll still be talking about Marilyn Monroe. Well, probably not. Yet, at the time of her death, people actually said, poor Marilyn, she'll be forgotten in 5 years. And yet, here we are today, 6 decades after her death. You're listening to me talking about Marilyn Monroe. So I guess we're still scratching that 60-year itch. Thanks very much